The problem about Rowan's approach to this is that, on the one hand, simply to accommodate the Sharia law is very difficult within a legal framework. Barno looked at this, and in her research was quite clear that actually the majority of Muslims that she talked to did not want that kind of accommodation. They didn't want a formal framework. They didn't want that kind of acknowledgement of difference. They preferred to maintain an informality in that kind of approach. And there were lots of arguments. The women that she spoke to argued vociferously that they felt that if you accommodated this formally into UK law, there could be abuses of power, all the kind of arguments that we would want to put forward. And Williams was aware of this, therefore he wanted to have a framework of responsibility that would be there, making those who actually administered Sharia law accountable to each other and to the wider law in some way. And that was okay as far as it went. But his view of responsibility was limited. So my argument is that he certainly wanted to get into the conversation, and he certainly wanted to move into some sense of accountability to law and to each other, but he missed the third element of responsibility. In an Aristotelian approach and in further developments on responsibility, there tend to be three levels, interactive levels of responsibility. One is the idea of agency. I am responsible for what I think and for the effects that I have upon others and upon the world. Secondly, the idea of accountability. I am accountable to certain people, stakeholders or whatever, and therefore I need to have the capacity to give an account of my thinking and my actions. But thirdly, a much wider notion of responsibility, and that's the idea of liability. This is the idea of shared responsibility with others for what we have, our community, our environment, and so forth. And one of the problems I want to argue with William's approach is that, in fact, he missed that out. And therefore, the core of his argument was all about accommodating difference, not actually looking at how difference can work together in shared responsibility, and how difference in that situation was, and is, I would argue, critical to any response in terms of society, any notion of multiculturalism. Gulen has a strong sense throughout his writing of responsibility, and it's a fascinating area. You can see how his thinking about responsibility has elements of Aristotelian thought. You can see how elements of it even move into sort of possibly existential. You know, I must take responsibility for my being and my response, and certainly elements of it move into that dreadful notion of postmodernity. I'm not going to define postmodernity. I'm not sure if it exists. Let's forget about those kind of terms just for the time being. But I want to argue that actually that notion of responsibility sits at the heart of a model of multiculturalism which I think he has to offer to society. The first part of that has an accountability which is directly faced towards God. So the individual and the Islamic world are responsible to God. This is based in creation theology, and clearly, as we've heard throughout the conference, this establishes this notion of vicegerency. It is up to us to give an account in action to God and in thinking to God. From that, he moves into a strong sense of that notion of responsibility as agency. Agency for us Westerners, for Westerners, sorry, forgive me, is so often seen as an individualistic thing, and so often seen as based around freedom. And so we often have the Isaiah Berlin distinction between freedom from or freedom to. You are free, you are an agent insofar as that you are free from oppression, you are an agent insofar as you are free to do something. Gulen takes it much further than that. A step on from that would be freedom to do your duty. Michael Novak. Does Michael Novak still operate in the US? Yeah, it does. Yes, but was that an approving or a disapproving? It was a disapproving Well, there you go. Gulen takes it beyond that, and this is something about freedom to create. Because if you're into creation theology and you have to respond to the impetus of God's creation, then you are about the freedom to create. It's a much richer notion of agency. But then he moves on wonderfully to this notion of liability, and I want to focus on that for a little bit. How's the timing? 5 minutes. Oh gosh. I'll briefly point out. Basically, it seems to me this notion of universal responsibility is where Gulen joins hands with an awful lot of these postmodern thinkers, from Levinas to Bauman and all these characters. The notion that we have to act as if we are responsible for everything and everybody, past, present, and future. An extraordinary thought. I mentioned that in a lecture to the European Business Ethics Network, actually in Turkey 3 years ago, and the response was a mystification. How can business people be responsible for everything in the past, the present, and the future? We had a good conversation. It was mostly American academics who couldn't cope with this, which was interesting. But he focuses on on that core notion of universal responsibility. As that develops, this is quite clearly based in the notion of being responsible in fact. We've heard this before, the notion that there is a spirituality at the core of Gulen, which is cognitive, affective, and somatic, and social. We want to see what it means. His spirituality is about seeing what the difference is. It's not about just knowing the idea of it, it's seeing the difference. And clearly that demands that we work together toward